We filled in the form, and when you click on Add Pick, the action is called from here, and we go into the Add Pick file, and we process that file. So let's take a look at what happens in Add Pick. And this is standard methodology for unpacking a form that has been submitted through HTML. And what we've got here is a whole sequence of sections of code. They're all if statements, and they check to see if a certain variable in the request has been set. And the names here, like name, address 1 and address 2, match the name attributes of each field in the form. So these always have to match, and this is how you make the linkage between the form itself that people are filling in and the request that is ultimately sent to the file that's going to unpack it and store it in the database. Now, in every case, what I'm doing in this logic is I am always setting a variable to some value. If it is not sent in from the form, I'm setting it to null here. But I can be guaranteed, because of the way that I've written this code, that all of these variables, like address 1 and address 2, will have some value, even if it's null. Let's take a look here at what's happening with HTML entities. This is a PHP function that we normally use to prevent certain security problems that could occur when people type in raw HTML code into a form field. And again, this all has to match up. So we've got here, we have the form. Here we have the code in the page that presents that form that will call the add pick file, and we're going to be using HTML entities to encode the data that is typed into the form. And I'll give you a little bit of a preview of the lib.php file as it will emerge, because when I am taking that data out of the database and I'm just about to display it in a function that's going to be called render pick, you can see that what's happening is I've encoded it here using the HTML entities function. And as I take each field out of the database, I'm decoding it using the same option here, end quotes. And so now, after I have gotten the data out of the database, when I'm about to display it, I now have something in a variable called the address or the city, state, zip, and so forth. And I've completed the reverse side of HTML entities encoding and HTML entity decoding, so I'm now back in the actual value that needs to be displayed. So the value that's going to be displayed is the value that was typed into the form when we were using Facebook. We type the value into the form, HTML entities encodes it, it gets stored in the database, and then when we are retrieving it, we decode it, and the value that appears on the screen as we've retrieved it from the database and decoded it is exactly the value that was typed into the form. So everything has to match up. Now, let me come back here to add pick, which is the code that actually is going to be storing the information in the database. I'm taking the fields by name out of the request that was submitted from the form. And again, these names have to match the names in the form. I don't necessarily have to map them one-to-one to fields in the database. It usually is easier to do that, but it doesn't have to be done. And particularly in the rendering methodology, I'm pulling fields out of the database, such as city, state, and zip. I'm decoding them, and as you can see here, what I'm doing is creating a new variable called the city, state, zip, which is concatenating those three separate fields in the database. So they were separate fields on the form. They are separate fields in the database, and I can then reformat them as I'm retrieving them. Nothing prevents you from doing additional manipulations. You can have one field on the form. You can then merge two fields together and store them in a single database field. But usually it's one field on the form to one field in the database. And you encode and decode, and now you're back to the values that should be displayed, the values that were entered on the form.